Did you know that there are 3 ways to ask a question in French? Keep watching to find out what they are. Bonjour, bonjour! I'm Keshi and this is Let Us Learn French, where we make French a little bit easier and a lot less confusing. Today, we talk about the different types of questions, as well as the different ways that you could ask a question in French. Let's go! First, there are 2 types of questions. The yes-no questions or the open-ended questions. An example of a yes-no question would be, did you do your homework? Yes or no? An example of an open-ended question would be, when did you finish your homework? Or a completely different example, what did you eat yesterday? Now let's talk about the 3 ways that you could ask a question in French. But for that, we will have to look at the 2 different types of questions. There are 3 ways that you would ask a question in French, whether it is a yes-no question or an open-ended question. But for open-ended questions, we will need something else. And we'll talk about that later in the video, but for now, let's look at the yes-no questions. And the 3 ways to ask a question are, first, using est-ce que. That's actually very common in French to just use est-ce que to make a question. An example of a question using est-ce que would be, est-ce que tu as fini tes devoirs? Est-ce que tu as fini tes devoirs? Did you finish your homework? The second way to ask a question is to just change the intonation of your voice when you're saying this sentence. I will say it in English first and it will make sense. You could say, you finished your homework, and that would be a statement. Or you could ask, you finished your homework? That's a question. That's another way of saying, did you finish your homework? You finished your homework? So that's a change in intonation right there. And the same can be done in French. Tu as fini tes devoirs? That's a statement. But tu as fini tes devoirs? That's a question. And the third way to ask a question in French is to use the inversion method or the inversion technique. And that's simply to start the question with the verb. So instead of saying tu as fini tes devoirs, the verb here is a fini, avoir fini, conjugated is a fini. And you would say, as-tu fini tes devoirs? As-tu fini tes devoirs? Did you finish your homework? Let's look at another example using all 3 of those techniques. Let's look at the statement, tu as mangé la pomme? You ate the apple, and turn it into a question. So if you have to use est-ce que, how would you say that? It would be, est-ce que tu as mangé la pomme? Est-ce que tu as mangé la pomme? And remember that no matter what technique you use, the intonation still matters. For example, in English, you wouldn't say, did you eat the apple? No, you would say, did you eat the apple? And it's the same thing in French. You wouldn't say, est-ce que tu as mangé la pomme? You would say, est-ce que tu as mangé la pomme? There's still like the rising intonation at the end. But when we say, tu as mangé la pomme, that intonation is even more important because that could be confused with the statement, tu as mangé la pomme, tu as mangé la pomme. Statement, tu as mangé la pomme? Question. And how would that be using the inversion method? Remember, you start with a verb this time. Yes, that would be, as-tu mangé la pomme? Great, now you're an expert in asking yes and no questions. But what about open-ended questions now? I said that you need to add something else to make it an open-ended question. And that something else is an interrogative word. And the interrogative words in French would be pourquoi, combien, comment, où, quand, qui. Pourquoi, why, combien, how much or how many, comment, how, où, where, quand, when, qui, who. If you remember the open-ended question that I asked at the beginning of the video, I said, when did you finish your homework? When. That's an interrogative word. So we need one of those interrogative words to make an open-ended question in French. but we still choose one of the three techniques that we talked about: est-ce que, the inversion technique, or the rising intonation. Sometimes it might not be clear how to use one of those three techniques with one of those interrogative words. So we'll look at an example with each of those interrogative words and each of those three different techniques. So we'll have 18 different sentences in all. Let's start. Let's start with the sentence Tu es allé à la plage. That's a statement. You went to the beach. Now let's use the interrogative word pourquoi, why, and ask why did you go to the beach? So using est-ce que, that would be pourquoi est-ce que tu es allé à la plage? Pourquoi est-ce que tu es allé à la plage? Using the rising intonation, that would be pourquoi tu es allé à la plage? And using the inversion technique, that would be pourquoi es-tu allé à la plage? You could ask combien est-ce que ça coûte? How much does this cost? Or combien ça coûte? The rising intonation technique. Or using the inversion technique, you could say ça coûte combien? Now let's look at comment, how, and that would be a very common example to ask comment est-ce que tu t'appelles? What is your name? Or more literally, how are you called? Or you could ask comment tu t'appelles? Or finally, using the inversion technique, comment t'appelles-tu? You've probably heard at least one of those ways of asking someone what their name is, and you might actually have heard all of them, maybe. They are all pretty common. Again, it would be comment est-ce que tu t'appelles? Comment tu t'appelles? Comment t'appelles-tu? Now for où, where. You could ask où est-ce que tu es? Where are you? Or you could ask tu es où? Finally, using the inversion technique, you could say où es-tu? So you might notice that the position of the où changes. For example, if you say tu es où, the où comes at the end. But if you say où es-tu, then it comes at the beginning. The same thing applies for qui, who. Qui est-ce que tu es? Tu es qui? Or qui es-tu? All of these mean who are you? I haven't heard qui est-ce que tu es that often. Qui es-tu or tu es qui sound more familiar. Now with quand, when, you could say quand est-ce que commence la fête? When does the party start? Or you could say elle commence quand la fête? It starts when the party. And finally, using the inversion technique, you would say quand commence la fête? When does the party start? Now, there's one very important interrogative word that I did not talk about yet. Do you know what it is? It is what. And the reason that I did not include it with the other ones is because it has two different translations in French. It could either be quoi or que, depending on how you're asking the question. So in general, if you just want to say what, like what happened, what, you would just say quoi. But if you want to ask a question using what, then you need to be careful about whether you're using quoi or que. You cannot actually use them interchangeably. Let's look at an example. You could ask que fais-tu? And that's using the inversion technique, because notice that the verb comes before the subject. Que fais-tu? Or if you want to use est-ce que, you could say qu'est-ce que tu fais? And that's very common. What are you doing? Qu'est-ce que tu fais? And here you use que plus est-ce que, and that becomes qu'est-ce que. So it's not que est-ce que, it's qu'est-ce que. Qu'est-ce que tu fais? Qu'est-ce que tu manges? What are you doing? What are you eating? So far we have used que, but if you're using the rising intonation technique, then you would use quoi. Tu fais quoi? You're doing what? What is your favorite way of asking a question? Do you prefer to use est-ce que, or do you prefer the rising intonation or the inversion technique? Let me know in the comments below. If you liked this video and got value out of it, please give it a big thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell notification so you never miss a video from us. And share this video with your family and friends who also want to learn French. As a thank you for sharing, here are 2 other videos for you. Enjoy! Thank you so much for watching until the end. Have a beautiful day, and I'll see you next Sunday. Take care.